Marcus and Daniel Fletcher had grown accustomed to being the town's favorite joke. The two brothers, barely scraping by on odd jobs and charity, had inherited what everyone called the most worthless building in Millbrook, a crumbling general store that hadn't seen a customer in 20 years. While neighbors whispered about their foolishness for keeping the place instead of selling it for scrap, the brothers quietly began the backbreaking work of cleaning decades of neglect. It was Marcus who first noticed the loose floorboard in the back room, and Daniel who pried it up to reveal something impossible: a hidden staircase descending into darkness. What they found in that forgotten room would challenge everything the town thought it knew about its past. But would the brothers' discovery prove to be salvation, or something far more dangerous than poverty had ever been? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning after their discovery, Marcus Fletcher stood in the doorway of what had once been Millbrook's busiest general store, watching his younger brother Daniel sweep mouse droppings from behind the counter. At 34, Marcus carried himself with the careful posture of a man who had learned to make every dollar stretch, his work-worn hands already stained from the cleaning supplies they could barely afford. Daniel, 2 years younger and still clinging to optimism despite their circumstances, hummed an old tune their grandfather used to whistle while he worked. 3 months had passed since they'd received the call from lawyer Hendricks about their inheritance. Ezra Fletcher, their grandfather, had died alone in the county nursing home, leaving behind nothing but debts, faded memories, and the deed to a building everyone considered worthless. The will itself was a simple document, yellowed with age, and written in their grandfather's careful script. To my grandsons, Marcus and Daniel, I leave the store that has been our family's heart for 60 years. May you find in it what I could never show you. Most folks in Millbrook thought the brothers had lost their minds. The building sat on Main Street like a rotting tooth, its windows boarded up, its signs so faded you could barely make out Fletcher's General Store beneath decades of weather damage. The roof leaked, the foundation had settled unevenly, and the heating system hadn't worked since the Clinton administration. Common sense dictated they should have sold it immediately to Morrison Development Company, which had made a modest but fair offer within days of their grandfather's funeral. But something in the old man's words had resonated with both brothers, though neither would admit it to the other. Growing up, they had spent countless summer afternoons in this store, listening to their grandfather's stories about the old days when Main Street bustled with activity, when farmers came to town on Saturdays and families gathered to share news and gossip. Ezra had spoken of the store as if it were alive, as if its walls held secrets that only the right person could uncover. The truth was, Marcus and Daniel desperately needed those secrets to be real. Their shared apartment above Kowalski's Deli cost $800 a month, and between Marcus's part-time work at the hardware store and Daniel's weekend shifts at the diner, they barely managed rent and groceries. Their mother had died when they were teenagers, their father had disappeared years before that, and their grandfather had been their only family. When he passed, they inherited not just a building, but the crushing weight of being the last Fletchers in a town that had once known their name with respect. The ledger books sat stacked on the store's main counter, their leather covers cracked and pages yellowed with age. Marcus had found them in a metal filing cabinet, perfectly preserved despite the building's decay. The earliest entries dated back to 1891, when their great-great-grandfather had first opened the store. Page after page documented the daily business of a thriving community enterprise, credit extended to struggling families, goods bartered for services, careful notations of inventory and sales. But it was the final entries, written in their grandfather's familiar handwriting, that puzzled Marcus most. Instead of normal business transactions, the last 20 pages contained cryptic notes that read more like coded messages than accounting records. Package delivered to Northern Route, 3 travelers, safe passage confirmed. Special inventory relocated to secondary storage. Access restricted, trust maintained, legacy preserved, future uncertain. Daniel had suggested they were just the confused writings of an old man whose mind was failing, but Marcus wasn't convinced. Their grandfather had been sharp until the end, his memory clear and his judgment sound. These entries felt intentional, deliberate, as if he had been documenting something important that he couldn't risk stating plainly. The afternoon brought Mrs. Henderson from the bank, her sensible shoes clicking against the warped floorboards as she surveyed the store's condition with barely concealed disgust. She was a practical woman who had known their grandfather for 40 years, and her expression carried the patient sympathy of someone delivering inevitable bad news. "Boys, I understand your sentimental attachment to this place, but you need to face reality," she said, adjusting her glasses as she examined a water stain on the ceiling. "The building needs at least $30,000 in repairs before it could even be considered habitable, let alone profitable." Morrison's offer is generous, considering the condition of the property. Marcus exchanged glances with Daniel across the room. They had already had this conversation a dozen times with well-meaning neighbors, bank officials, and local business owners. Everyone agreed that holding on to the store was financial suicide, that two men with no capital and no business experience had no hope of reviving an enterprise that had been failing for decades. But standing there among the dust and debris, surrounded by the remnants of their family's history, both brothers felt something that had been missing from their lives since childhood, a sense of belonging to something larger than their own immediate survival. The next morning brought a cold October rain that found every weakness in the store's failing roof. Marcus positioned buckets throughout the main room, while Daniel worked to cover the ledger books with plastic sheeting. Each drop that struck the metal containers echoed through the empty space like a countdown timer, marking the steady deterioration of their inheritance. Their savings account, never substantial to begin with, had dwindled to less than $400 after purchasing basic cleaning supplies, a few tools, and materials to board up the worst of the broken windows. The reality of their situation pressed down on both brothers with the weight of the sagging ceiling beams above their heads. "Maybe we should listen to Mrs. Henderson," Daniel said, wringing dirty water from a mop into a bucket. "Take Morrison's offer and use the money to start fresh somewhere else." Marcus looked up from where he was attempting to repair a section of rotted floorboard. "Start fresh doing what? We've got high school educations and a history of minimum wage jobs. That money would last us maybe 2 years if we're careful. And then what? Then we'd still be better off than we are now, trying to resurrect a business that died before we were born." The accusation hung in the air between them, heavy with frustration and fear. Daniel had always been the more practical of the two brothers, quick to cut losses and move on when situations became untenable. Marcus, by contrast, had inherited their grandfather's stubborn streak, the same quality that had kept Ezra Fletcher operating a failing store for 30 years after it stopped making financial sense. As they worked, Marcus found himself drawn repeatedly to the ledger books. During breaks from the physical labor of cleaning and repairs, he would sit at the old counter and study his grandfather's entries, searching for patterns in the cryptic notations. The store's decline was documented in painful detail. Fewer customers each year, longer lists of unpaid debts, inventory that gathered dust for months before being sold at a loss. But the profitable years told a different story entirely. In the 1940s and 1950s, Fletcher's General Store had been the commercial heart of Millbrook. The ledgers showed steady income from dry goods, hardware, and farm supplies, plus a thriving credit system that helped local families through difficult seasons. More intriguingly, there were regular notations about special orders and private deliveries that generated substantial payments but were never itemized in detail. "Look at this," Marcus called Daniel over to the counter, pointing to an entry from September 1943. "Grandfather received a payment of $500 for consultation and storage services. That would be worth thousands today," Daniel peered over his brother's shoulder at the faded ink. Storage services for what? That's what I can't figure out. There are dozens of these entries throughout the 1940s and early 1950s, always for substantial amounts, always vaguely described. Marcus flipped through several pages, showing his brother similar notations. And look at this. Every one of these special payments is marked with the same symbol. In the margin next to each mysterious transaction, their grandfather had drawn a small compass rose, no larger than a dime, with careful attention to the directional points. The symbol appeared nowhere else in the ledgers, not even next. To the largest regular sales or most important business dealings, that afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. Morrison himself appeared at the store's front door, his expensive suit incongruous against the building's shabby exterior. He was a man in his 50s, with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to getting his way. His silver hair perfectly styled, despite the damp weather. "Gentlemen," he said, stepping carefully around a bucket collecting rainwater, "I hope you'll forgive the intrusion. I was hoping we might discuss your property situation." Marcus wiped his hands on a rag and stepped forward. "Mr. Morrison, we weren't expecting you personally. Well, I believe in handling important matters face to face." Morrison's eyes swept the interior of the store, taking in the water damage, the rotting wood, the obvious signs of decades of neglect. "I have to say, I admire your determination, but surely you can see that this building is beyond salvage." "We're still evaluating our options," Daniel said. Though his tone lacked conviction, Morrison smiled the practiced smile of a man accustomed to closing difficult deals. "I understand sentiment, truly I do. But sentiment doesn't pay for new roofs or structural repairs. My company is prepared to increase our offer by 20%, which I think you'll agree is more than generous for a property in this condition." The increased offer represented enough money to change their lives completely, enough to relocate, enough to pursue education or training, enough to break free from the cycle of poverty that had defined their adult years. Marcus saw the temptation in his brother's eyes, the same calculation he was making himself, but something about Morrison's eagerness troubled him. The man had made 3 visits to the store in the past month, each time increasing his offer despite the building's obvious deterioration. Property developers didn't typically pursue failing buildings in dying towns with such persistence, unless they knew something others didn't. "We appreciate the offer," Marcus said carefully. "But we're not ready to make a decision yet." Morrison's smile flickered slightly. "Time isn't always our friend in these situations, gentlemen. Buildings in this condition tend to deteriorate rapidly, especially with winter approaching. What seems salvageable today might be a total loss by spring." After Morrison left, the brothers returned to their work in silence, each lost in his own thoughts about the future. The rain continued to fall, and the buckets continued to fill, marking time in a building that seemed determined to crumble around them, regardless of their intentions or efforts. 3 days of intensive cleaning had transformed the store's main room from chaos to merely disheveled. As Marcus scrubbed years of grime from the windows, allowing natural light to flood the space for the first time in decades, he began to notice details that had been hidden in the shadows. The floorboards weren't uniform throughout the building. Sections near the back wall were made from different wood, slightly newer and fitted with unusual precision. Daniel was reorganizing the ledger books when he made the discovery that would change everything. Tucked between the binding and back cover of the 1943 ledger was a piece of paper so thin it was nearly transparent, folded into a square no larger than a postage stamp. When he carefully unfolded it, his hands trembling with anticipation, he found himself looking at what appeared to be a hand-drawn map. "Marcus, you need to see this." The map was drawn in pencil on what looked like onion skin paper, the kind their grandfather had used for carbon copies of important documents. It showed the outline of the store building, but with additional details that didn't match the current layout. Underground passages were indicated by dotted lines, extending from beneath the store to 3 different points around the town square. Most intriguingly, one passage was marked with the same compass rose symbol they had found in the ledger entries. Marcus studied the map with growing excitement. This shows tunnels under the building. But why would Grandfather hide this? Maybe because it's not supposed to exist, Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper. Look at these dates in the corner, 1863, 1943, 1955. This map was updated multiple times over nearly a century. The implications were staggering. If the map was accurate, their grandfather hadn't just been running a failing general store, he had been maintaining some kind of underground network that had operated for generations. The mysterious payments in the ledgers suddenly took on new meaning, as did his cryptic final entries about special storage and safe passage. That afternoon, driven by curiosity and hope in equal measure, the brothers began a systematic examination of the store's floor. Using a small hammer, Marcus tapped each board, while Daniel listened for changes in the sound that might indicate hollow spaces beneath. The work was tedious, and their progress slow, but their grandfather's map gave them specific areas to focus their search. It was Daniel who found the first anomaly. Near the back corner of the store, exactly where the map indicated the entrance to the main passage, 3 floorboards produced a distinctly different sound when struck. The wood was slightly warped, as if it had been removed and replaced multiple times over the years. Mrs. Pemberton arrived just as the brothers were examining the suspicious floorboards. At 78, she was one of the few people in Millbrook who remembered their grandfather in his prime, and her sharp eyes missed little of what happened in the small town. She moved slowly but purposefully, her cane tapping against the floor as she surveyed their work. "Your grandfather was a good man," she said without preamble, settling into the old chair behind the counter. "Helped a lot of people over the years, sometimes in ways that couldn't be talked about openly." Marcus looked up from his examination of the floorboards. "What kind of ways?" Mrs. Pemberton was quiet for a long moment, studying both brothers with the careful assessment of someone deciding whether to share a long-kept secret. "There are stories about this store, stories that go back to before your grandfather's time. Stories about people who came through Millbrook during dangerous times and found help here." "What kind of people?" Daniel asked. "The kind who couldn't use the regular roads or stay in regular hotels. The kind who needed to travel at night and hide during the day." She paused, her gnarled fingers tracing patterns on the counter's worn surface. "Of course, these are just old stories. Probably nothing to them, but the way she said it, the meaningful look she gave both brothers, suggested there was considerably more to these stories than idle gossip. Mrs. Pemberton had lived in Millbrook her entire life, had known every family, and witnessed every significant event in the town's history. If she was hinting at something, it was worth pursuing. After she left, the brothers returned to their investigation with renewed purpose. Using a crowbar they had borrowed from the hardware store, Marcus carefully pried up the first of the suspicious floorboards. Beneath it, instead of the dirt foundation they expected, was a wooden frame that appeared to support a removable section of flooring. Daniel grabbed a flashlight and peered into the space below. "There's definitely something down there. It looks like worked stone, not just a crawl space." As they removed the second board, the outline of a staircase became visible. The stones were fitted with the precision of professional masonry, and the steps descended into darkness beyond the reach of their flashlight. Carved into the stone lintel above the opening was a compass rose identical to the symbol in their grandfather's ledgers. The discovery confirmed what the map had suggested, but seemed too incredible to believe. Their failing general store sat above an elaborate underground chamber that had been constructed with considerable skill and expense. The questions that arose were even more compelling than the discovery itself. Who had built this hidden space? Why had their family maintained it for generations? And what secrets lay waiting in the darkness below? The discovery of the staircase consumed both brothers' thoughts through a sleepless night. By dawn, they had returned to the store with better equipment, a powerful LED lantern, measuring tape, and a digital camera to document whatever they might find. The entrance they had uncovered was clearly the beginning of something significant, but neither brother was prepared for what lay beneath their grandfather's store. Marcus descended first, his footsteps echoing against stone walls that felt solid and professionally constructed. The staircase was steep but well-maintained, each step worn smooth by decades of use. As his lantern illuminated the space below, he found himself in a chamber that defied every assumption he had made about their inheritance. The underground room was larger than the store's main floor, its ceiling supported by brick archways that spoke of serious engineering expertise. The walls were lined with wooden shelving, and the air carried the faint scent of old paper and preserved wood. Most remarkably, the space was completely dry, despite the building's obvious water problems above. "Daniel, you have to see this," Marcus called up the staircase, his voice filled with wonder. When both brothers stood together in the hidden chamber, they realized they were looking at something that had been carefully maintained for generations. The shelving contained hundreds of items: books, documents, photographs, personal belongings, and small valuables, all organized with meticulous care. Everything was labeled with dates and initials, creating a catalogue that spanned nearly 80 years. But it was the desk in the center of the room that drew their immediate attention. Made from the same oak as the store's original counter, it had obviously been crafted specifically for this space. The drawers were secured with an old-fashioned brass lock, and sitting prominently on the desktop was an envelope addressed in their grandfather's handwriting for Marcus and Daniel Fletcher. When the time comes, Daniel picked up the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a brass key ornately carved with Masonic symbols, and a brief note. "This key opens more than locks. It opens the truth about our family's real business. Use it wisely, and remember that some responsibilities are inherited along with privileges." The key fit perfectly into the desk's lock, and the drawers slid open to reveal their grandfather's true legacy. The top drawer contained maps of the entire region, showing underground passages, safe houses, and routes that connected to similar networks throughout the state. The second drawer held correspondence dating back to the 1940s, written in careful code, but clearly documenting the movement of people through the area. Marcus studied one of the letters, dated October 1943, and felt the pieces beginning to fall into place. "Daniel, I think our grandfather was running an underground railroad station, but that was Civil War era. These letters are from World War II, a different kind of underground railroad. Look at these names, these dates. People were still traveling in secret, still needing safe passage through hostile territory." Marcus pointed to a map showing routes that extended north into Canada. Political refugees, escaped prisoners of war, people fleeing persecution who couldn't use official channels. The bottom drawer contained the most precious items of all, photographs of the people who had passed through this hidden chamber. Families with children, elderly couples, young men and women traveling alone, all captured in moments of hope and desperation. On the back of each photograph, their grandfather had written brief notes. "The Kowalski family, safe passage to Montreal, December 1944. Hans Müller, German defector 3 nights before continuing to New York. August 1943. The scope of the operation was breathtaking. For decades, their grandfather had maintained this secret network, providing shelter and assistance to people who had nowhere else to turn. The mysterious payments in his ledgers represented contributions from grateful families and supporters who understood the risks he was taking. But the most shocking discovery came when Daniel found a small wooden box hidden behind the maps. Inside were dozens of letters written to their grandfather from the people he had helped, testimonials to his courage and compassion. One letter, dated 1955, was signed by a man who had become a prominent civil rights leader after escaping persecution in the South. Another, from 1963, came from a family of Hungarian refugees who had eventually settled in California and built a successful business. "My God," Daniel whispered, reading through the letters. "Grandfather saved all these people, and he never said a word about it." Marcus was examining the construction of the chamber itself, noting the careful ventilation system, the reinforced ceiling, and the second exit that led to a tunnel extending toward the town square. This wasn't just charity, Daniel. This was a serious operation that required significant resources and planning. And look at this. He pointed to a newer section of the wall, where more recent repairs were evident. Their grandfather had been maintaining this space until very recently, suggesting that the network might have remained active much longer than either brother had imagined. The implications were staggering. Their worthless inheritance was actually the headquarters of a humanitarian operation that had operated in secret for generations. The building they had been prepared to abandon was a monument to their family's commitment to helping others at great personal risk. But with this discovery came troubling questions. If their grandfather had been maintaining this operation until recently, who else knew about it? And why was Morrison so determined to buy a building that appeared worthless on the surface, but contained secrets that could rewrite the history of their small town? The brothers spent the entire next day exploring the hidden chamber, each discovery adding new layers to their understanding of their grandfather's secret life. The correspondence they found painted a picture of a network that had evolved and adapted over decades, helping different groups of people as historical circumstances changed. The earliest letters, dating to the 1940s, dealt primarily with European refugees fleeing Nazi persecution. These were followed by correspondence from the 1950s, involving people escaping communist regimes in Eastern Europe. The 1960s brought a new wave of correspondence related to civil rights activists fleeing persecution in the Deep South. And the pattern continued through the decades. Marcus discovered a leather-bound journal hidden in a secret compartment of the desk, written entirely in their grandfather's careful handwriting. The entries revealed the emotional toll of operating such a dangerous network, the constant fear of discovery, and the satisfaction of knowing that families were reaching safety because of his efforts. June 15, 1962, Marcus read aloud. "The Thompson family arrived last night, 3 children under 10 years old. The youngest girl reminds me of Sarah at that age. I pray they reach Detroit safely. The risks grow greater each year, but how can we turn away people whose only crime is believing in equality?" Daniel was examining a collection of newspaper clippings that had been carefully preserved in manila folders. The articles documented various civil rights incidents, refugee crises, and political upheavals, with certain names and locations highlighted in their grandfather's familiar handwriting. It was clear that Ezra Fletcher had been following national and international events not as a casual observer, but as someone whose work was directly affected by political developments. But it was the discovery of a second wooden chest, hidden behind a false wall panel, that truly revealed the scope of their grandfather's operation. Unlike the desk drawers, this chest required a different key, one they found hanging on a small hook behind the journal. When Marcus opened it, both brothers gasped at what they found inside. The chest contained stacks of carefully preserved letters, each one a testimonial from someone whose life had been saved by their grandfather's network. But more than that, it contained evidence of the financial support that had made the operation possible. Dozens of families had contributed money over the years, some as expressions of gratitude after reaching safety, others as advance payments for services they hoped never to need. "Look at this," Daniel said, holding up a letter dated 1971. "This is from the mayor of Millbrook, thanking grandfather for services rendered to the community." The mayor knew what was happening. Marcus examined other letters and found similar evidence that their grandfather's operation had been known and supported by prominent community members. Bank President Hutchinson had written to thank Ezra for maintaining important community traditions. Judge Morrison, the father of the developer who now wanted to buy their building, had contributed a substantial sum in 1965 with a note praising Ezra's commitment to American values. The financial records in the chest told a remarkable story. Over the decades, grateful families and supportive community members had contributed more than enough money to sustain the operation and maintain the building. Their grandfather had been far from the failing businessman they had imagined. He had been the carefully disguised administrator of a significant humanitarian enterprise. But the most shocking discovery came when Daniel found a manila envelope marked "Current Operations" in a section of the chest that contained the most recent materials. Inside were documents dating to just 6 months before their grandfather's death, including correspondence with refugee assistance organizations and notes about people who might need the network's services. Marcus, I think grandfather was still active until the very end. Look at this letter from the International Rescue Committee dated last Christmas. They were discussing potential refugees from Syria who might need temporary shelter while their asylum applications were processed. The implications were staggering. Their grandfather hadn't just operated a historical curiosity, he had maintained an active humanitarian network that was still relevant in the modern world. The building they had inherited wasn't just a monument to past good deeds. It was a functioning resource that people might still need. As they continued to explore the chamber, they found evidence that the network extended far beyond their grandfather's individual efforts. Maps showed connections to similar operations in neighboring towns, and correspondence revealed a sophisticated system of communication and coordination. Their grandfather had been part of something much larger than they had imagined. The most disturbing discovery was a folder marked "Security Concerns" that contained newspaper clippings about harassment of refugee assistance organizations and notes about people who had shown suspicious interest in the building over the years. Their grandfather had clearly been worried about the safety and secrecy of his operation, especially in recent years. One note, dated just 2 months before his death, was particularly troubling. Morrison Development Company continues to make inquiries about the building. Their interest seems excessive for a simple commercial purchase. Recommend extreme caution in any dealings with this organization. The brothers looked at each other across the chamber, both thinking the same thing. Morrison's persistent offers for their building suddenly made perfect sense, not because he wanted to develop the property, but because he knew about the secrets it contained. The question was whether his interest was motivated by historical curiosity, personal greed, or something more sinister. As evening approached and they prepared to return to the surface, both brothers understood that their discovery had fundamentally changed their situation. They were no longer simply the inheritors of a failing business, but the reluctant guardians of a legacy that had saved countless lives over multiple generations. The responsibility was both overwhelming and inspiring. But it also made their decision about the building's future infinitely more complex. The discovery that would change their lives forever came 3 days later. Hidden behind a section of shelving that Daniel noticed was slightly askew from the wall. When they moved the heavy wooden unit, they found a third key taped to its back, along with a note in their grandfather's handwriting: "For emergencies only." The families who contributed this wanted it to help others in need. The key unlocked a steel door concealed behind what had appeared to be solid stone wall. Beyond the door was a smaller chamber, dry and perfectly preserved, containing a sight that left both brothers speechless. Stacked against the walls were wooden crates and metal strongboxes, each carefully labeled with dates and initials. When Marcus opened the first crate with trembling hands, they found themselves looking at genuine treasure. Gold coins gleamed in the lantern light, American eagles, Canadian maple leafs, and older pieces that looked like they belonged in a museum. The coins were organized in cloth bags, each marked with amounts and dates spanning from the 1940s to just 2 years ago. Conservative estimates suggested they were looking at hundreds of thousands of dollars in precious metals alone, but the gold was only part of the treasure. The strongboxes contained jewelry, precious stones, rare stamps, and historical artifacts that had been donated by grateful families over the decades. Each item was accompanied by a card explaining its origin. Donated by the Rosenberg family, 1943, in gratitude for safe passage to Canada. Given by Maria Santos, 1967, to support the network's continued operations. Daniel found himself holding a diamond necklace that had belonged to a Hungarian countess who had fled the communist regime in 1956. The accompanying note, written in elegant script, explained that the necklace was a family heirloom that she wanted to contribute to help other refugees reach safety. Similar stories accompanied dozens of other valuable items, each one representing a family's gratitude and desire to help others in their situation. The most touching discoveries were the letters tucked into each container. Families had written detailed accounts of their journeys, their fears, and their overwhelming relief at finding help when they needed it most. Many had included photographs of their new lives in America or Canada, showing children who had grown up safe and free because of the network's assistance. Marcus read one letter aloud, his voice thick with emotion. To the kind people who helped us escape East Berlin in 1961. Our daughter is now a doctor in Chicago. Our son teaches at a university in Toronto. The gold coins we left are nothing compared to the gift of freedom you gave our family. Please use them to help others who need what we needed. The financial value of the treasure was staggering, but its emotional significance was even greater. Every item represented a life saved, a family reunited, a person given the chance to build a new future. Their grandfather had been the custodian of this wealth, but clearly had never used it for personal gain. The modest way he had lived, the apparent failure of his store, had all been carefully maintained facades to protect the real purpose of his life's work. But as the brothers catalogued the treasure, they faced the same moral complexity that must have troubled their grandfather for decades. This wealth had been accumulated through decades of gratitude and generosity, but it had originally been paid for safe passage during desperate times. Some families had undoubtedly given more than they could afford, sacrificing precious possessions to ensure their survival. What are we supposed to do with all this? Daniel asked, overwhelmed by the scope of their discovery. Marcus was examining a collection of rare books that had been donated by a Jewish professor who had escaped Germany in 1938. I think the answer is in the letters. These people didn't give these things to make us rich. They gave them to keep the network operating, to help other people who would need the same assistance. Among the most recent additions to the treasure cache were items that confirmed their grandfather's continued activity until his final years. A collection of gold coins, dated 2019, had been contributed by a family of Syrian refugees who had been helped to reach relatives in Canada. The accompanying letter, written in careful English, explained that the father had saved the coins from his jewelry business before fleeing Damascus, and wanted to ensure that others could receive the same help his family had found. The discovery of the treasure cache forced both brothers to confront the true magnitude of what they had inherited. They weren't just the owners of a failing building, they were the inheritors of a humanitarian legacy that had operated for generations and had accumulated substantial resources to continue that mission. The responsibility was both humbling and terrifying, but the treasure also raised disturbing questions about Morrison's interest in their property. If word of the hidden wealth had somehow leaked out, it would explain his persistent offers and his willingness to pay above market value for a building that appeared worthless. The thought that their grandfather's carefully guarded secret might have been compromised filled both brothers with a cold dread. As they secured the treasure chamber and prepared to return to the surface, Marcus and Daniel understood that their lives had been irrevocably changed. They possessed wealth beyond their wildest dreams, but that wealth came with obligations they were only beginning to understand. The easy choice would be to take the treasure and disappear, starting new lives far from Millbrook and its complications. But the letters and photographs surrounding them made it clear that their grandfather had expected something different from his inheritors, a commitment to continuing the work that had defined his life and given meaning to the lives of countless others. The anonymous letter was waiting for them the next morning, slipped under the store's front door sometime during the night. The envelope bore no postmark, no return address, just their names written in block letters that seemed deliberately disguised. Inside, the message was brief and chilling. Some secrets are worth more than buildings. Smart men know when to take good offers and leave town. Not everyone who helped your grandfather is still alive. Marcus read the letter twice before showing it to Daniel, both brothers feeling the chill of implied threat. The timing couldn't have been coincidental. Less than 24 hours after discovering the treasure cache, someone was warning them that their activities were being monitored. Someone knows, Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper. Someone knows what we found down there. The question is how much they know and what they want, Marcus replied, though his hands were trembling as he folded the letter. And whether they're connected to Morrison's offers. The brothers spent the morning conducting a careful examination of the building's exterior, looking for signs that someone had been watching them or attempting to gain access. They found no obvious evidence of surveillance, but the feeling of being observed had settled over both men like a heavy blanket. Every car that passed on Main Street, every neighbor who glanced in their direction, every unexpected sound from the building seemed potentially threatening. Their paranoia proved justified when Mrs. Patterson from the diner mentioned seeing unfamiliar men sitting in a dark sedan across from the store on 2 separate evenings. She had assumed they were interested buyers or perhaps investigators from Morrison's company. But her description, middle-aged men in expensive suits who seemed more interested in watching the building than examining it, suggested something more sinister. The discovery that truly frightened them came when Daniel noticed that someone had been in the store during their absence. Nothing was obviously disturbed, but items had been moved. Books shifted slightly on shelves, papers rearranged on the counter, dust patterns broken in ways that indicated careful searching. Most disturbing was the evidence that someone had found and examined the entrance to the hidden chamber. Though the floorboards had been carefully replaced, they were looking for something specific, Marcus said, studying the subtle signs of intrusion. This wasn't random vandalism or casual burglary. Someone knew exactly what to look for. The brothers' research into their grandfather's associates revealed why their discovery might have attracted dangerous attention. The network that Ezra Fletcher had maintained hadn't operated in isolation. It had been part of a larger system that involved wealthy donors, political connections, and occasionally people with questionable backgrounds who had their own reasons for supporting underground operations. Among their grandfather's papers, they found references to donors whose money had come from sources that weren't entirely legitimate. Businessmen who had profited from wartime contracts, politicians who had used the network for their own purposes, and even criminals who had supported the operation as a form of insurance against future prosecution. The network's good work had sometimes been funded by people with complicated motives. More troubling were the references to people who had opposed the network's activities. Their grandfather had kept careful records of threats and harassment, including several incidents where supporters had been intimidated or worse. A banker in the neighboring county who had helped fund safe houses had been killed in what was officially ruled an accident. A minister who had provided sanctuary for refugees had been found dead in his church, apparently from a heart attack. Though he had been a healthy man in his 50s, the pattern suggested that knowledge of the network's operations and resources could be dangerous for anyone involved. Their grandfather's careful secrecy hadn't just been about protecting the people he helped. It had been about protecting himself and his supporters from people who had various reasons for wanting the operation shut down, when Morrison called that afternoon to schedule another meeting. His timing seemed far too convenient to be coincidental. His voice carried a different tone than in previous conversations, less patient, more insistent, with an undercurrent of urgency that hadn't been present before. "Gentlemen, I think it's time we had a more serious discussion about your building," he said. "I'm prepared to make my final offer, and I think you'll find it very attractive. Shall we say tomorrow morning at 10? After hanging up, Marcus and Daniel looked at each other with the shared understanding that their situation had become genuinely dangerous. They possessed knowledge and resources that other people were willing to threaten and possibly kill for, and they were completely unprepared to defend themselves against professional intimidation. The evening brought another disturbing development when they noticed the same dark sedan that Mrs. Patterson had described parked at the end of Main Street. The car's occupants were too distant to identify, but the vehicle's presence felt like a clear message that their activities were being monitored continuously. As night fell, the brothers secured the store as best they could and retreated to Daniel's apartment, carrying with them only the most crucial documents from their grandfather's records. They had discovered a treasure beyond their wildest dreams, but they were beginning to understand that some discoveries came with a price that might be higher than they were prepared to pay. Mrs. Pemberton's visit the next morning came as a relief to both brothers, who had spent the night jumping at every sound and checking the locks repeatedly. She arrived carrying a thermos of coffee and wearing the determined expression of someone who had made a difficult decision. "Boys, we need to talk," she said, settling into her usual chair behind the counter. "I've been watching what's been happening around here, and I think it's time I told you what I know about your grandfather's real work." Marcus and Daniel exchanged glances, unsure how much they should reveal about their discoveries. But Mrs. Pemberton's next words removed any doubt about her knowledge. "I know about the room downstairs. I know about the people your grandfather helped over the years. And I know you boys are in danger because of what you found." The revelation that Mrs. Pemberton had been aware of their grandfather's secret operation came as both a shock and a relief. She explained that she had been one of his closest confidants for over 40 years, helping to coordinate safe house arrangements and providing cover stories when suspicious people asked too many questions about unusual activity in town. "Your grandfather didn't work alone," she continued, pulling a small photograph from her purse. "There were 6 families in this county who supported the network, and I was the coordinator between them all." The photograph, taken in 1965, showed their grandfather standing with 5 other people in front of the store. Mrs. Pemberton pointed to each figure, identifying them as the core group that had maintained the underground network for decades. The man standing next to their grandfather was Judge Morrison, the current developer's father. Judge Morrison was one of our strongest supporters until the late 1960s, Mrs. Pemberton explained. He provided legal protection when we had problems with local authorities, and his family contributed substantial funds to the operation. But something changed after his son Richard came back from Vietnam. Richard Morrison, the current developer pursuing their building, had returned from military service with what Mrs. Pemberton diplomatically described as different ideas about America and who deserved help. He had been horrified to discover his father's involvement in what he saw as assistance to communist sympathizers and political subversives. Richard threatened to expose the entire network unless his father stopped his support. Mrs. Pemberton continued. Judge Morrison was torn between his son and his principles, but eventually he felt he had no choice. He withdrew from our group in 1971, but I always suspected he regretted that decision. The family conflict had created a lasting rift between father and son that eventually poisoned Richard Morrison's relationship with the entire network. When Judge Morrison died in 1995, Richard had inherited not just his father's wealth and business connections, but also his detailed knowledge of the underground operation that had operated in Millbrook for decades. Mrs. Pemberton produced another photograph, this one more recent, showing their grandfather with several other elderly people at what appeared to be a reunion gathering. This was taken just 2 years ago. Your grandfather stayed in touch with the network members who were still alive, and we met every year to remember the people we had helped, and to discuss whether our services might still be needed. The photograph revealed that the network had remained active much longer than the brothers had realized. Mrs. Pemberton explained that while the large-scale refugee movements of the post-war era had ended, there had continued to be individuals and families who needed assistance, victims of domestic violence, fleeing abusive situations, undocumented immigrants facing deportation, and political activists whose safety was threatened by their work. The treasure you found wasn't just from grateful families of the past, Mrs. Pemberton said, confirming that she knew about their discovery. People continued to contribute to the network right up until your grandfather's death. That money was being saved for a major expansion of our operations. The expansion plan, she explained, had involved purchasing safe houses in 3 neighboring counties and establishing a more sophisticated communication system to coordinate with refugee assistance organizations. Their grandfather had been planning to use the accumulated treasure to create a permanent foundation that could continue the network's work for future generations. But Mrs. Pemberton's most disturbing revelation concerned Richard Morrison's recent activities. She had been monitoring his business dealings and had discovered that he was not simply a property developer interested in commercial opportunities. Morrison had been systematically purchasing buildings throughout the region that had historical connections to underground networks, apparently attempting to acquire and destroy sites that could provide evidence of activities his father had supported. "He's not just trying to buy your building for development," Mrs. Pemberton warned. "He wants to erase the evidence of what happened here, to rewrite the history of this town to match his version of what America should be." The elderly woman reached into her purse and produced a manila envelope thick with documents. "These are copies of everything your grandfather and I documented about Richard Morrison's activities. Financial records, surveillance reports, evidence of intimidation tactics he's used against other property owners. You'll need this information if you decide to fight him." As Mrs. Pemberton prepared to leave, she shared one final piece of crucial information. The other surviving members of the network, 3 elderly individuals living in neighboring towns, were prepared to support the brothers in whatever decision they made about continuing their grandfather's work. But she warned that Morrison had been putting pressure on these people as well, trying to force them to reveal what they knew about the network's operations and resources. "You boys have inherited more than a building and some treasure," she said, her voice carrying the weight of decades of shared secrets. "You've inherited a responsibility to protect the memory of everyone who risked their lives to help others. The question is whether you're prepared to accept that responsibility, knowing the dangers that come with it." Morrison arrived at precisely 10 o'clock the next morning, but he wasn't alone. 2 men in expensive suits accompanied him, introduced only as associates who specialized in property acquisition challenges. Their presence transformed what had been framed as a friendly business negotiation into something that felt distinctly like intimidation. "Gentlemen," Morrison began, his tone noticeably different from their previous meetings, "I hope you've had time to consider the generous nature of my offer. I'm prepared to finalize the purchase today with a cashier's check." He placed a leather portfolio on the counter and opened it to reveal a purchase agreement already filled out with numbers that made both brothers' hearts race. The offer was nearly double what he had proposed just 2 weeks earlier. Enough money to solve every financial problem they had ever faced and provide security for the rest of their lives. But Marcus noticed something troubling about the contract. Buried in the dense legal language was a clause requiring the sellers to vacate the property within 48 hours of closing and to surrender all keys, documents, and any materials found on the premises. Another clause prohibited them from ever discussing the property's history or contents with anyone, including historical societies or government agencies. "This is very generous," Marcus said carefully. "But we're still considering our options." Morrison's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "I'm afraid this offer expires today. The property market in this area is quite volatile, and my investors are concerned about potential complications that might arise from prolonged negotiations." One of Morrison's associates stepped forward, a man whose physical presence seemed designed to intimidate. "Mr. Morrison has been very patient with you gentlemen, but there are other interested parties who might not be as understanding about delays." Daniel felt his mouth go dry. "What kind of other parties?" "The kind who sometimes get impatient when property owners don't respond appropriately." "To reasonable offers," the man replied with a thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. Morrison opened his briefcase and produced a thick folder of documents. "Perhaps these will help clarify your situation. We've done extensive research on this property, and we're aware of some interesting historical connections that might complicate any future development plans." The folder contained photocopies of historical documents that made both brothers' blood run cold. Property records from the 1940s showing unusual utility installations, building permits for storage facilities that had never been publicly documented, and most disturbing of all, a list of people who had owned or operated businesses in buildings with similar historical significance, along with notations about what had happened to them when they refused to cooperate with development plans. "Knowledge can be a burden," Morrison continued, his voice carrying an undertone of menace, "especially knowledge about activities that some people might consider unpatriotic or even treasonous. The current political climate can be quite unforgiving toward people who supported certain types of humanitarian activities." Marcus realized that Morrison wasn't just threatening them financially, he was threatening to publicly expose and discredit their grandfather's humanitarian work by reframing it as support for enemies of America. In the current climate of political polarization, such accusations could destroy their family's reputation and potentially expose them to serious legal consequences. "Of course," Morrison added, "purchasing the property would resolve all of these potential complications. My company has experience in handling sensitive historical materials discreetly." The implicit threat was clear. Sell the building and the secrets it contained would be safely buried forever. Refuse, and Morrison would use his knowledge of the underground network to destroy both brothers' lives and the memory of everyone their grandfather had helped. But as Morrison laid out his terms, Marcus noticed something interesting about the man's demeanor. Despite his confident threats and generous offer, Morrison seemed nervous, even desperate. His hands trembled slightly as he handled the documents, and his eyes kept darting toward the back of the store, where he suspected the entrance to the hidden chamber was located. "We need time to consider this," Daniel said, though his voice lacked conviction. "I'm afraid time is a luxury you don't have," Morrison replied. "This offer expires at 5 o'clock today. After that, I'll be forced to pursue other options for acquiring this property." After Morrison and his associates left, the brothers sat in stunned silence, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the decision they faced. The money Morrison was offering would solve all their financial problems and allow them to start fresh somewhere far from Millbrook and its complications. But accepting his offer would mean betraying their grandfather's legacy and ensuring that the evidence of decades of humanitarian work would be destroyed forever. More troubling was the realization that Morrison's knowledge of the underground network extended far beyond what they had imagined. His references to other interested parties and his detailed documentation of similar properties suggested that he was part of a larger effort to systematically eliminate evidence of underground railroad activities. Throughout the region, The brothers spent the afternoon researching Morrison Development Company and discovered a troubling pattern. Over the past decade, the company had purchased and demolished more than 20 buildings in 4 counties, all of which had historical connections to abolitionist activities or refugee assistance networks. In each case, the previous owners had eventually agreed to sell after facing various forms of pressure and intimidation. As 5 o'clock approached, Marcus and Daniel faced the most difficult decision of their lives, knowing that whatever choice they made would have consequences that extended far beyond their own future security. The argument erupted at 4:30, just 30 minutes before Morrison's deadline expired. Daniel had been pacing the store's main room for the past hour, his anxiety building with each tick of the old clock on the wall. When he finally spoke, his words came out in a rush of fear and frustration. "We have to take the money, Marcus. We're not equipped to fight people like Morrison. We're 2 broke guys from a dying town, and he's got lawyers and thugs and enough resources to destroy us." Marcus looked up from the counter where he had been studying their grandfather's journals, searching for guidance that might never come. "So we just let him win? We let him erase everything grandfather spent his life building?" "Grandfather's dead," Daniel shouted, his voice echoing through the empty store. "He's dead, and we're alive, and we have a chance to take enough money to actually build decent lives for ourselves. Why should we sacrifice our futures for dead people's secrets?" The words hung in the air between them, cruel in their honesty. Daniel immediately regretted his outburst, but the sentiment behind it reflected fears that had been building since they discovered the treasure cache. He was tired of being poor, tired of watching other people succeed while he struggled to pay rent, tired of living in a town that offered no opportunities for young men without college degrees or family connections. Marcus closed the journal slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled, because those dead people's secrets represent something more important than money. Because our grandfather spent 60 years of his life helping people who had nowhere else to turn. Because if we sell out now, we're saying that none of that mattered. "It doesn't matter if we're dead or in prison," Daniel shot back. "You saw those men with Morrison. You read those documents about what happened to other people who refused to cooperate. This isn't some noble cause. It's survival." The brothers had been building toward this confrontation for days, their different personalities and perspectives creating an inevitable collision as the pressure mounted. Marcus had always been the idealist, the one who believed in doing the right thing regardless of personal cost. Daniel had always been the pragmatist, willing to compromise principles if it meant avoiding disaster. "I've been thinking about this all week," Daniel continued, pulling a folded piece of paper from his pocket. "I found a job listing in Chicago, decent pay, benefits, a chance to start over. With Morrison's money, I could afford to relocate, maybe even go back to school." Marcus stared at the job application, feeling betrayed not just by his brother's secret planning, but by his willingness to abandon their shared inheritance. "You've already made up your mind. One of us has to be realistic about our situation. We inherited a disaster, Marcus. A building that's falling down, debts we can't pay, and secrets that could get us killed. The smart thing, the only sane thing, is to take the money and get out. What about the people grandfather helped? What about the families who trusted him with their most precious possessions? What about the responsibility we inherited along with the treasure?" Daniel's frustration boiled over. "I didn't ask for that responsibility. I didn't choose to inherit a humanitarian mission that I'm completely unqualified to handle. I wanted a simple inheritance, some money, maybe a house, something that would improve my life instead of complicating it beyond recognition." The accusation cut deeply because Marcus recognized the truth in it. Neither brother had been prepared for the magnitude of what they had discovered, and both were struggling with obligations that seemed far beyond their capabilities. But where Daniel saw an overwhelming burden, Marcus saw an opportunity to give meaning to lives that had been drifting without purpose. "So you're just going to run away?" Marcus said, his voice thick with disappointment. Take the money and pretend none of this happened. I'm going to survive, Daniel replied. I'm going to take care of myself instead of trying to save the world with good intentions and no resources. The clock on the wall chimed 5 times, and both brothers fell silent, realizing that Morrison's deadline had passed while they argued. In the distance, they could hear a car pulling up outside the store, probably Morrison coming to learn their decision. Daniel grabbed his jacket from the chair behind the counter. I can't do this, Marcus. I can't be the person Grandfather wanted us to be. I'm sorry, but I'm not built for this kind of fight. As Daniel headed toward the back door, Marcus felt the weight of isolation settling over him like a heavy blanket. He had lost his brother's support at the moment when he needed it most, and Morrison was waiting outside with an offer that would solve all their problems, if only Marcus was willing to betray everything there Grandfather had stood for. The sound of Daniel's footsteps fading into the alley behind the store was followed by the insistent knocking of someone at the front door. Morrison had come for his answer, and Marcus would have to face him alone, knowing that whatever decision he made would define not just his own future, but the fate of a humanitarian legacy that had taken generations to build. The 2 weeks following Daniel's departure were the loneliest of Marcus's life. He told Morrison that he needed more time to consider the offer, buying himself space to think by claiming he needed to locate his brother to finalize any sale. Morrison's patience was clearly wearing thin, but the legal requirement for both brothers' signatures gave Marcus a temporary reprieve. During the day, he threw himself into the physical work of restoration with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He repaired sections of flooring, patched holes in the walls, and methodically cleaned and organized the store's contents. The physical labor helped quiet his mind, but it couldn't eliminate the constant awareness that he was probably fighting a losing battle against forces far more powerful than himself. His evenings were spent in the hidden chamber, reading through his grandfather's journals and correspondence, searching for guidance about how to proceed. The more he learned about the network's operations, the more he understood the complexity of what his grandfather had accomplished. Running a successful underground operation required not just courage and compassion, but political connections, financial resources, and sophisticated planning that Marcus felt completely unqualified to provide. The journal entries from his grandfather's final years revealed a man wrestling with similar doubts about the future of his life's work. Who will continue this work when I'm gone? Ezra had written just 6 months before his death. Marcus and Daniel are good boys, but they don't understand the world that created this network. Perhaps it's time to let this chapter of history end with dignity rather than watching it fail through inexperience. But other entries suggested that Ezra had maintained hope that his grandsons would find their own way to honor the network's legacy. The specific methods may change, but the need for people willing to help others will never disappear. I pray that Marcus and Daniel will find the courage to carry this work forward in whatever form their generation requires. Marcus's solitude was broken only by Mrs. Pemberton's daily visits. She brought food, helped with small repairs, and provided a connection to the network's history that helped him feel less isolated. Through her, he learned that the other surviving network members were watching his situation with interest and concern, prepared to offer support if he decided to continue the operation, but unable to intervene directly without exposing themselves to Morrison's retaliation. Your grandfather went through periods of doubt too, Mrs. Pemberton told him one evening as they sat in the hidden chamber surrounded by decades of accumulated history. In the 1970s, when the political climate turned against humanitarian work, he seriously considered shutting down the operation. But then a family would arrive needing help, and he'd remember why the work mattered. She showed him photographs from the network's more recent activities, Syrian refugees who had been helped to reach Canada in 2018, a family of Honduran asylum seekers who had been provided temporary shelter in 2019, domestic violence victims who had been given safe passage to protective facilities as recently as 6 months before Ezra's death. The need didn't end with the Underground Railroad, Mrs. Pemberton explained. It just changed forms. There are still people who need help moving from dangerous situations to safe ones. Still families who fall through the cracks of official assistance programs. The knowledge that people might still need the network's services weighed heavily on Marcus's decision. Taking Morrison's money would provide financial security for himself and Daniel, but it would also eliminate a resource that vulnerable people had depended on for generations. The moral complexity of the choice kept him awake at night, staring at the ceiling and trying to imagine what his grandfather would have wanted him to do. His grandfather's final journal entry, dated just 2 weeks before his death, provided some clarity. The treasure was never meant to make my inheritors wealthy. It was meant to give them the resources to continue helping others. If they choose a different path, I will understand. But I hope they will find a way to honor the sacrifice of everyone who contributed to this work. Marcus began keeping his own journal, documenting his thoughts and struggles as he worked alone in the store. The entries revealed his growing connection to his grandfather's mission and his increasing determination to find a way to preserve the network's legacy, even if he couldn't continue its operations in their original form. "I'm not the man grandfather was," he wrote. "I don't have his connections or his experience or his natural ability to inspire trust in desperate people. But I have his stubborn streak and his belief that some things are worth fighting for, even when the odds are terrible." The pressure from Morrison continued to mount. Phone calls became more frequent and more threatening, and Marcus began noticing the same dark sedan parked near his apartment and the store on alternating days. The surveillance was no longer subtle. It was designed to remind him that his movements were being monitored and his options were limited. But instead of wearing down his resolve, the intimidation tactics strengthened Marcus's determination to resist. Each threat reminded him of the courage his grandfather had shown in protecting vulnerable people from powerful forces, and each day alone in the store deepened his understanding of the legacy he had inherited. Daniel returned on a Tuesday morning in November, arriving unannounced, just as Marcus was opening the store for another day of solitary restoration work. His younger brother looked tired and thinner than when he had left, and carrying a backpack and wearing the expression of someone who had spent long hours wrestling with difficult decisions. "I couldn't do it," Daniel said without preamble, setting his pack down beside the counter. "I got to Chicago, found an apartment, even started the job. But I couldn't stop thinking about what we found down there. About all those people grandfather helped." Marcus felt a surge of relief, so intense it nearly knocked him off his feet, though he tried to maintain his composure. "What changed your mind?" Daniel pulled a thick folder from his backpack, its contents neatly organized with the methodical care that had always characterized his approach to research projects. "I spent 2 weeks in the Chicago Public Library, learning everything I could about Underground Railroad operations in the Midwest. Marcus, what grandfather was doing wasn't just local charity work. He was part of a network that saved thousands of lives over multiple generations." The folder contained photocopies of historical documents, academic papers, and newspaper articles that Daniel had carefully compiled during his time away. He had traced the connections between their grandfather's operation and similar networks throughout Illinois, Wisconsin, and Michigan, discovering a sophisticated system of safe houses and transportation routes that had operated continuously for over a century. "Look at this," Daniel said, spreading maps across the counter. "These are all the documented Underground Railroad sites in our region. But these," he pointed to a series of red marks he had added, "are buildings that Morrison Development has purchased and demolished in the past 10 years. He's not just trying to erase our grandfather's work, he's systematically destroying evidence of the entire regional network." Marcus studied the maps with growing amazement. Daniel had documented Morrison's activities across 4 states, showing a pattern of property acquisitions that couldn't possibly be explained by normal commercial development. The man was spending millions of dollars to purchase and destroy buildings that had historical significance but little commercial value. "There's more," Daniel continued, producing another section of documents. "I found records of similar operations in other parts of the country. Developers connected to white supremacist organizations have been targeting underground railroad sites for years, trying to eliminate physical evidence of multiracial cooperation and humanitarian assistance. The research revealed that Morrison was part of a nationwide effort to rewrite American history by destroying sites that documented successful resistance to oppression. The strategy was subtle but effective. Without physical evidence, stories of humanitarian networks could be dismissed as legends or propaganda, allowing revisionist historians to minimize the scope and significance of abolitionist activities. "So what do we do?" Marcus asked, though he suspected Daniel had already formulated a plan. "During his weeks away, we fight back, not just by preserving our building, but by documenting and protecting the entire network of sites before Morrison can destroy them." Daniel opened his laptop and showed Marcus a website framework he had been developing. "We create a digital archive of everything we know about underground railroad operations in our region. We contact historical societies, universities, and preservation groups. We make the information so public and so widely distributed that Morrison can't suppress it." The plan was ambitious and risky, but it offered something that simply taking Morrison's money could never provide. A way to honor their grandfather's legacy while actively continuing his work in a form suited to their own generation's capabilities. Daniel had also researched the legal protections available for historic properties, discovering that buildings with documented Underground Railroad connections could be eligible for federal preservation funding and historical designation that would make them much more difficult to demolish or develop. Mrs. Pemberton was right when she said we inherited a responsibility, Daniel said. But that responsibility isn't just to maintain one building or continue one operation. It's to make sure that the story of what these people accomplished doesn't disappear from history. Marcus felt a surge of pride in his brother's transformation. The young man, who had fled to Chicago in fear and confusion, had returned with a mature understanding of their situation and a realistic plan for moving forward. Daniel had found a way to honor their grandfather's legacy while playing to their own strengths and resources. "There's something else," Daniel said, his expression growing serious. "While I was researching Morrison's activities, I found evidence that he's been using intimidation tactics against other property owners. 3 people who refused to sell to him have had suspicious accidents or legal problems. We're not just fighting to preserve our inheritance, we're fighting for our safety." The brothers spent the rest of the day reviewing Daniel's research and planning their next steps. For the first time since discovering the hidden chamber, they felt like they had a coherent strategy that could actually succeed. They weren't just trying to preserve their grandfather's secrets. They were working to ensure that those secrets became part of the permanent historical record where they could inspire future generations. The breakthrough in their research came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Pemberton arrived at the store on Thursday morning carrying a manila envelope that she had been hesitant to share, even with the brothers' grandfather. Inside were documents that revealed the true scope of Morrison's family history and his personal motivations for destroying Underground Railroad sites. "I've been debating whether to show you these for weeks," she said, settling into her usual chair. "Your grandfather and I disagreed about how much you boys needed to know about the darker side of this history. But after seeing what Daniel uncovered about Morrison's activities, I think you need to understand exactly what you're fighting against." The documents dated back to the 1850s and told a story that cast Morrison's current activities in a sinister new light. His great-great-grandfather, Samuel Morrison, had been one of the most notorious slave catchers in the region. making a fortune by tracking down escaped slaves and returning them to their owners for substantial bounties. Samuel Morrison's business records, preserved in family papers that had somehow made their way to Mrs. Pemberton decades earlier, documented a systematic operation that had disrupted Underground Railroad activities throughout the Midwest. He had employed networks of informants, bribed local officials, and used violence and intimidation to force abolitionists to abandon their humanitarian work. The money that built the Morrison family fortune came from human misery, Mrs. Pemberton explained. Samuel Morrison was paid premium rates for capturing escaped slaves, and he invested those profits in land and businesses that his descendants still control today. But the documents revealed something even more disturbing. Samuel Morrison had kept detailed records of Underground Railroad operations, documenting safe houses, routes, and the identities of conductors and supporters. His intelligence network had been sophisticated enough to rival law enforcement agencies, and he had used that information not just to capture fugitives, but to systematically destroy the infrastructure that helped them. Judge Morrison, Richard's father, had discovered these family papers in the 1960s and had been horrified by his ancestors' activities. His support for their grandfather's humanitarian network had been motivated partly by guilt over his family's historical role in perpetuating slavery and partly by a genuine desire to atone for past wrongs. Judge Morrison tried to make amends for his family's history, Mrs. Pemberton continued. He donated substantial amounts of money to civil rights organizations and used his legal influence to protect Underground Railroad sites. But when Richard came back from Vietnam, he had very different ideas about his family's legacy. The final document in Mrs. Pemberton's collection was a letter that Judge Morrison had written to their grandfather shortly before his death in 1995. In it, he warned that his son Richard had discovered the family's slave-catching records and was planning to use them to identify and target sites that had been part of the Underground Railroad network. Richard sees his ancestors' work as patriotic service, the letter explained. He believes that Samuel Morrison was protecting American property rights and maintaining social order. He's convinced that modern preservation of Underground Railroad sites is part of a conspiracy to promote white guilt and undermine American values. Marcus and Daniel exchanged glances as they absorbed the implications of this revelation. Morrison wasn't just a greedy developer trying to maximize profits from historical properties. He was a man driven by ideological hatred who was using his inherited wealth to complete his ancestors' work of destroying Underground Railroad operations. The brothers spent the rest of the day researching Samuel Morrison's activities and cross-referencing them with their grandfather's records. They discovered that many of the families their grandfather had helped had been descendants of people who had been captured and returned to slavery by Samuel Morrison in the 1850s. The Underground Railroad network that operated in the 20th century had been partly a response to the damage that Morrison's ancestor had inflicted on earlier humanitarian efforts. This explains everything, Daniel said, studying maps that showed Samuel Morrison's hunting routes overlapping with the sites that Richard Morrison had targeted for demolition. He's not trying to develop these properties. He's trying to finish what his great-great-grandfather started. The discovery of Morrison's true motivations transformed their situation from a simple property dispute into something much more significant. They weren't just defending their inheritance, they were fighting against a generational campaign to erase evidence of successful resistance to oppression, but the documents also provided them with powerful ammunition for their own fight. Samuel Morrison's records contained detailed information about Underground Railroad operations that had never been documented elsewhere, including the identities of conductors and supporters whose contributions to history had been forgotten. This information could be invaluable to historians and preservationists working to document the full scope of abolitionist activities in the region. "We need to get this information to the right people," Marcus said, recognizing that they now possessed evidence that could fundamentally change historical understanding of Underground Railroad operations in their region. "But we also need to be prepared for Morrison to escalate his pressure when he realizes what we know." Mrs. Pemberton nodded grimly. "Richard Morrison has spent decades trying to suppress this information. When he discovers that you have access to his ancestors' records, he'll do whatever it takes to stop you from making them public." Morrison's patience finally ran out on a cold Friday morning in late November. He arrived at the store with a small army of people, his 2 associates from before, a woman who introduced herself as a legal representative, and 3 men who looked like they had been hired for intimidation rather than negotiation. The group filled the store's main room, their presence transforming the space into something that felt more like a courtroom than a place of business. "Gentlemen," Morrison began, his voice carrying none of the false friendliness from their earlier meetings, "I think it's time we ended this charade. You've had ample opportunity to accept my generous offer, and your continued delays are beginning to interfere with important development timelines." Marcus and Daniel stood behind the counter, flanked by Mrs. Pemberton and 2 other elderly residents who had arrived that morning, claiming they wanted to see how this business played out. The brothers had called them for moral support, but their presence also served as witnesses to whatever Morrison planned to do. "We've decided not to sell," Marcus said, his voice steadier than he felt. "This building has historical significance that we believe should be preserved." Morrison's laugh was cold and humorless. "Historical significance? This is a failing general store in a dying town. What possible historical significance could it have?" Daniel stepped forward, carrying the folder of documents they had prepared. "The kind of significance that comes from being a documented stop on the Underground Railroad. The kind that qualifies for federal historical protection and preservation funding." The change in Morrison's expression was immediate and dramatic. His confident smirk vanished, replaced by something that looked like genuine alarm. His eyes darted to his associates, and Marcus could see the unspoken communication passing between them. "I don't know what fantasy you boys have been entertaining," Morrison said, but his voice lacked conviction. "But there's no evidence that this building was ever connected to any Underground Railroad activities." "Actually, there is," Mrs. Pemberton said, rising from her chair with more authority than her 78 years usually displayed. "Quite a bit of evidence, as it happens, including some very interesting documents about your family's historical involvement in this region." Morrison's face went pale, and his legal representative whispered something urgent in his ear. The woman had obviously been briefed about potential historical complications, but Morrison's reaction suggested that his own family's connections to the Underground Railroad were more sensitive than he had anticipated. Daniel opened his folder and spread several documents across the counter where Morrison could see them. "We've been doing some research, Mr. Morrison. Did you know that your great-great-grandfather, Samuel Morrison, was one of the most successful slave catchers in the Midwest? Made quite a fortune returning escaped slaves to their owners. Ancient history." Morrison said, but his voice was strained. "Maybe," Marcus continued, "but the records he kept about Underground Railroad operations are very current for historians trying to document abolitionist activities. Amazing how detailed his intelligence was about conductors, safe houses, and routes, almost like he was running a surveillance operation." Morrison's associates moved closer to the counter, their body language shifting from casual intimidation to genuine threat. But Mrs. Pemberton had anticipated this development and had made her own preparations. "Before you boys do anything foolish," she said loudly enough for everyone in the room to hear, "you should know that copies of all these documents have already been sent to the State Historical Society, the National Park Service, and 3 different universities with African American studies programs. Any harm that comes to these young men will only draw more attention to information you'd prefer to keep quiet." The standoff stretched for several tense minutes, with Morrison's team clearly calculating their options, while the brothers waited to see how far the man was willing to go to suppress the historical evidence they possessed. Finally, Morrison's legal representative stepped forward. "Mr. Morrison, I strongly advise against any actions that might be construed as intimidation or harassment. The historical documentation these people claim to possess could create significant legal complications for our development projects." Morrison's fury was evident, but he was clearly intelligent enough to recognize that the situation had shifted beyond his control. The brothers had transformed themselves from isolated targets into public advocates for historical preservation, making any aggressive action against them potentially counterproductive. "This isn't over," Morrison said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "You have no idea what you're interfering with or who you're challenging. There are larger forces at work here than your little preservation project. We're beginning to understand that," Daniel replied, "which is why we're making sure that this information becomes as public as possible. Hard to suppress evidence when it's scattered across dozens of institutions and research projects." As Morrison and his team filed out of the store, Marcus felt both relief and apprehension. They had successfully called Morrison's bluff and demonstrated that they couldn't be easily intimidated. But they had also escalated a conflict with a man who clearly had substantial resources and few scruples about how he used them. "Well," Mrs. Pemberton said once they were alone, "that went better than I expected. But I suspect Mr. Morrison will be exploring other options for dealing with this situation." The transformation of Millbrook's attitude toward the Fletcher brothers began with a simple article in the local newspaper. Mrs. Henderson from the bank, who had initially pressured them to sell, had witnessed Morrison's confrontational visit from across the street and had called the newspaper to report what she had seen. The resulting story, headlined "Local Developer Threatens Property Owners Over Historical Building," sparked a reaction that surprised everyone involved. By Monday morning, a steady stream of visitors had begun arriving at the store. Some came out of curiosity, drawn by the newspaper's vague references to significant historical discoveries. Others came with specific knowledge about their family's connections to Underground Railroad activities. Stories that had been passed down through generations but never officially documented. Martha Kowalski, whose family owned the deli where the brothers rented their apartment, was among the first to arrive with family documents. Her great-grandmother had written letters describing how the Fletcher store had provided shelter for her family when they fled political persecution in Poland in 1923. The letters, carefully preserved in Polish and never translated until now, provided detailed accounts of the assistance they had received and their gratitude for Ezra Fletcher's help. "I always wondered why my great-grandmother spoke so highly of your grandfather," Martha said, spreading the translated letters across the counter. "She used to say he was an angel sent by God to help people in their darkest hours." Dr. Williams from the local college arrived that afternoon with 3 graduate students and a collection of oral histories they had been gathering about Underground Railroad activities in the region. Their research had documented rumors about the Fletcher store for years, but they had never been able to find concrete evidence to support the stories they had. Collected from elderly community members, this could be the most significant Underground Railroad discovery in our county's history, Dr. Williams explained to a growing crowd of interested residents. "If the documentation you found is authentic, it could fundamentally change our understanding of how extensive these networks actually were." The college's involvement lent academic credibility to the brothers' claims and attracted attention from regional historical societies and preservation organizations. By Wednesday, representatives from the State Historical Society had arrived to examine the brothers' evidence and begin the process of formally documenting the site's significance. But the most powerful Support came from the community members themselves. A petition began circulating, calling for the building to be designated as a local historical landmark and expressing opposition to any development that would compromise its preservation. The petition was organized by people who had initially criticized the brothers for their impractical attachment to a failing building, but who now understood that they were protecting something far more important than a piece of real estate. Mayor Thompson, who had been neutral in the conflict between the brothers and Morrison, publicly announced the town's support for historical preservation efforts. Millbrook has always been proud of its history, he declared at a crowded town hall meeting. Learning about the courageous activities that took place at the Fletcher store only adds to that pride. This town will support any effort to preserve and honor this important heritage. The economic implications of the discovery quickly became apparent. Dr. Williams estimated that a properly preserved and interpreted underground railroad site could attract thousands of visitors annually, providing tourism revenue that the struggling town desperately needed. Local business owners who had initially supported Morrison's development plans began to reconsider their positions as they calculated the potential benefits of heritage tourism. Morrison's response to the community's awakening was swift and vindictive. Within days of the petition circulation, several local businesses that had supported the preservation effort received visits from building inspectors who discovered numerous code violations that required expensive corrections. The harassment was subtle but effective, designed to demonstrate Morrison's influence with local officials and his willingness to use that influence against anyone who opposed his interests. But the intimidation tactics backfired, generating more sympathy for the brothers' cause and more determination to resist Morrison's pressure. Mrs. Patterson from the diner organized a fund to help businesses pay for the unexpected code violation fines, and the local newspaper began investigating connections between Morrison development and the sudden increase in regulatory enforcement. The brothers found themselves at the center of a community mobilization that had grown far beyond their original intention to simply preserve their grandfather's building. Daniel's website documenting underground railroad sites had attracted national attention, and historians from universities across the Midwest were requesting access to the brothers' archives. "This is bigger than we ever imagined," Marcus said to Daniel as they watched a television news crew setting up equipment outside the store. Grandfather's work is inspiring people he never met to continue fighting for the values he believed in. The community petition had grown to include over 3,000 signatures, including support from residents of neighboring towns who were dealing with similar pressure from developers targeting historical sites. The Fletcher brothers had become symbols of resistance against efforts to erase inconvenient history, and their story was resonating with people who understood the importance of preserving evidence of America's complicated past. But even as support for their cause grew, both brothers remained aware that Morrison had not abandoned his objectives. The man had too much invested in his campaign to suppress Underground Railroad evidence to be deterred by community opposition, and his threats about larger forces at work suggested that the brothers were facing challenges that extended far beyond their small town's politics. The official designation came through on a snowy December morning, delivered by a representative from the National Park Service who had driven from Springfield to personally present the brothers with the documents that would change their lives forever. Fletcher's General Store had been approved for inclusion in the National Register of Historic Places, a designation that provided federal protection against demolition and qualified the building for substantial preservation grants. This is one of the most significant underground railroad discoveries in recent years, explained Dr. Sarah Chen, the Park Service historian who had overseen their application. The documentation you've provided fills crucial gaps in our understanding of how these networks operated in the 20th century. Your grandfather's records will be invaluable to researchers for generations to come. The federal designation effectively ended Morrison's ability to acquire and demolish the building. But it also came with new responsibilities that the brothers were still learning to navigate. Preservation grants required detailed planning, professional oversight, and compliance with strict historical accuracy standards that would transform their amateur restoration efforts into a sophisticated professional operation. Daniel had thrown himself into the administrative challenges with the same methodical approach he had brought to his research in Chicago. He had applied for grants from historical foundations, coordinated with university researchers who wanted to study their grandfather's archives, and developed relationships with tourism organizations interested in promoting the site as a heritage destination. Marcus focused on the physical restoration work, collaborating with preservation specialists to ensure that their repairs maintained the building's historical integrity while making it safe and accessible for public visits. The work was slower and more expensive than their original efforts, but it was also more satisfying because each improvement brought them closer to honoring their grandfather's memory in a way that would educate and inspire future visitors. The hidden chamber had been transformed into a museum space, with professional display cases protecting the most fragile artifacts while making them accessible to researchers and visitors. The treasure that had originally seemed like the solution to all their problems had been donated to a foundation that would use it to support Underground Railroad research and preservation efforts throughout the region. Grandfather would have approved, Marcus said to Daniel as they watched a team of graduate students carefully cataloging the correspondence collection. He saved this material so it could help people understand what happened here. Now it's doing exactly that. The brothers' decision to donate the treasure rather than keep it had been difficult but felt right. They had used a small portion to fund the building's restoration and to establish a modest income for themselves as site managers. But the bulk of the wealth went toward creating an endowment that would ensure the building's preservation and operation in perpetuity. Morrison's final attempt to stop the preservation effort had come in the form of a lawsuit, challenging the historical designation, claiming that the brothers had fabricated evidence to defraud federal agencies. But his legal challenge crumbled when Mrs. Pemberton and the other surviving network members testified about their direct knowledge of Ezra Fletcher's activities, providing corroboration that made the historical evidence unassailable. The lawsuit's failure had apparently convinced Morrison to abandon his efforts in Millbrook, though Daniel's research suggested he had simply shifted his focus to Underground Railroad sites in other states where he faced less organized opposition. The brothers had won their immediate battle, but the larger war against historical erasure continued elsewhere. The store's reopening as the Ezra Fletcher Underground Railroad Museum was scheduled for Martin Luther King Day, a date chosen to honor the connection between their grandfather's work and the broader civil rights movement. The ceremony would be attended by descendants of families their grandfather had helped, academic researchers who had studied the site, and community members who had supported the preservation effort. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. A letter arrived from the International Rescue Committee, the organization that had been in correspondence with their grandfather until his death, asking if the brothers would consider reviving the building's role as a resource for refugees and asylum seekers in need of temporary assistance. There are still people who need the kind of help your grandfather provided, the letter explained. Modern refugee assistance has become more institutionalized, but there are always individuals and families who fall through the cracks of official programs. A restored Underground Railroad site could serve as both a historical monument and a functioning resource for people who need sanctuary. The proposal opened possibilities that neither brother had considered. Their grandfather's work could continue not just as historical education, but as active humanitarian service, bridging the gap between honoring the past and addressing present needs. "What do you think?" Daniel asked, showing Marcus the letter as they stood in the restored store, surrounded by the tools and materials of their preservation work. Marcus looked around the space that had been transformed from a crumbling relic into a living monument to human compassion. The building felt alive again, filled with purpose and hope instead of decay and abandonment. "I think Grandfather would say that the best way to honor history is to learn from it," Marcus replied. "And what he learned was that there's always someone who needs help. And there's always something we can do to provide it." The final letter from their grandfather was discovered 3 months after the museum's opening, hidden in a space behind the restored counter that had been revealed only when workers were installing new electrical wiring. The envelope was marked simply "For my grandsons, when they are ready," and inside was a message that brought both brothers to tears. "If you are reading this," the letter began in Ezra Fletcher's careful handwriting, "then you have found your way to the truth about our family's real business. More importantly, you have found your way to understanding why that business mattered. I have watched both of you struggle with the question of what kind of men you wanted to become, and I have hoped that discovering your inheritance would help you find the answer." The letter went on to explain that Ezra had deliberately left the building in apparent disrepair and the family's humanitarian legacy hidden, believing that his grandsons needed to discover their purpose through their own choices, rather than having it imposed upon them by obligation or expectation. "True commitment cannot be inherited," he wrote. "It must be chosen freely, with full understanding of both the rewards and the costs. I'm proud that you chose to honor the work that gave my life meaning. But I am prouder still that you found your own way to continue that work in forms I never could have imagined." The museum had indeed become something beyond what their grandfather could have envisioned. In its first 6 months of operation, the Ezra Fletcher Underground Railroad Museum had welcomed over 12,000 visitors, generating enough tourism revenue to fund ongoing preservation efforts while creating employment opportunities for local residents who served as guides and interpreters. But the building's role as a modern sanctuary had proven even more significant. Working with the International Rescue Committee and other refugee assistance organizations, the brothers had established a discreet program that provided temporary shelter and support for asylum seekers whose cases were pending in immigration courts. The hidden chamber that had once sheltered escaped slaves now offered refuge to families fleeing violence and persecution. In their home countries, the program operated with the same careful secrecy that had characterized their grandfather's work, but with the added protection of legal oversight and coordination with official agencies. Families typically stayed for only a few days or weeks while their paperwork was processed, or while they waited for placement in permanent housing. But that brief respite often made the difference between successful asylum claims and deportation to dangerous situations. Marcus had found his calling in the hands-on work of restoration and hospitality, learning skills in historic preservation while serving as the practical caretaker for families who needed immediate assistance with basic needs like food, clothing, and medical care. His gentle manner and genuine concern for others made him effective at helping traumatized people feel safe and welcome during their stays. Daniel had discovered talents for research, administration, and advocacy that he had never known he possessed. His documentation of Underground Railroad sites had expanded into a regional network of preservation efforts, and his advocacy work had helped secure protection for dozens of historically significant buildings that had been threatened by development. The brothers' transformation had been noticed by the community, members who had known them as struggling young men with no apparent direction in life. Mayor Thompson had appointed them to the town's Historical Preservation Commission, and Dr. Williams had offered Daniel a position as a research associate. With the college's African American Studies program, I keep thinking about what grandfather wrote about true commitment being chosen rather than inherited, Daniel said to Marcus as they stood together in the museum's main room, watching a group of elementary school students examine the displays with fascination and wonder. I think we've proven that he was right, Marcus replied. We could have taken Morrison's money and walked away from all of this. Nobody would have blamed us for making the practical choice, but we would have blamed ourselves, Daniel said. Once we understood what this place represented, once we saw how much it meant to people, there really wasn't any other choice we could live with. The museum's guest book contained entries from visitors who had traveled from across the country to learn about their grandfather's work. Descendants of families their grandfather had helped wrote about the impact his assistance had made on generations of their relatives. Researchers thanked the brothers for preserving documentation that had filled crucial gaps in historical understanding. And asylum seekers, writing anonymously, expressed gratitude for sanctuary that had given them hope during the darkest periods of their lives. Reading those entries each evening had become Marcus and Daniel's way of remembering why their work mattered and why their grandfather's legacy deserved to be preserved and continued. They had inherited far more than a building or treasure. They had inherited the opportunity to make their lives meaningful by serving something larger than themselves. Before we jump back in tomorrow, Marcus said, echoing the familiar phrase from countless stories, I want you to know how proud I am that we found our way here together. Daniel smiled, understanding that his brother was referring not just to their physical location in the restored store, but to their discovery of purpose and partnership that had transformed them from struggling individuals into committed guardians of an important legacy. Outside, the first spring flowers were beginning to bloom in the garden that Mrs. Pemberton had helped them plant beside the museum. Like their grandfather's work, like the building itself, like the brothers' own transformation, the garden represented the possibility of growth and renewal that came from patient nurturing and unwavering faith in the future.